Welcome to CT's Histories. Today we'll be talking about historic shooting, sewing, crafts, and exploring the past. This video series is part of Corey's Trading Post on Facebook and CT's Paper-Clad Paper Models. I've done a lot of different time periods with my historic sewing, but I really like Civil War stuff. So today we'll be talking about a basic Confederate shell jacket. This is my take on a Confederate shell jacket that would have been privately purchased from a civilian tailor or possibly sent from home to the troops at the front line. It is authentic, but it's not documentable. In other words, the fabrics and sewing techniques used are all period. But this is not a reproduction of a specific surviving jacket. This is not a government-issued depot jacket. I borrowed ideas and sewing styles common to the period and used in many surviving jackets. It is a typical six-piece body. I went with the one-piece sleeves on this one, and of course the common standing collar. It closes with a 9-button front. All the sewing is by hand, and even though they did have sewing machines back then, it got really hard real quick to find sewing machine needles in the South. This jacket would have been an expensive jacket as it's actually 100% imported wool. The wool would have came from France or England. As most of you know, the common Confederate soldier would have been dressed in homespun or jean cloth, which is basically the same thing. It was a combination of wool and cotton. This is 100% wool, so this would have been either from pre-war stocks of wool, which again would have been expensive, or this jacket or the wool for it would have been imported through the blockade. Okay, here's a basic look at all the different parts for a jacket. On the right, you'll see the body of the jacket and how the armhole where the sleeve attaches is kind of an odd shape. That was the common shape. On the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see that one-piece sleeve. That sleeve is not shaped. It's kind of large. These type of sleeves were found on the North Carolina depot jackets. They were also found on the so-called Columbus depot jackets, as well as many others. And of course, they were very common in frock coats and civilian coats throughout the time period. You'll also note that I have epaulets or shoulder boards, shoulder straps being shown in this picture. I ended up not using them. They became increasingly unpopular during the war, and in fact the Richmond Depot ended up getting rid of them completely by the end of the war, simply because the soldiers weren't using them. Both the shoulder straps and the belt loops were deleted. So to start construction, we're going to start with the collar first. Just sew the collar pieces, the two halves of the collar at the center seam. And then the center seam is flat felled. The string, the thread does not go all the way through the layers at this point. It just catches the fuzz or the nap, and it holds that seam nice and flat. Then you sew the interfacing and the other half of the collar on the center seam. And again, you open that seam up, you flat fell it like that's being shown there on the right, and that'll give it a nice, secure, and flat finish. Next, we'll sew the sleeve ends together. You start at the cuff end, you sew the sleeve end, and you'll note in these pictures that the lining and the outer sleeve are actually shaped differently. The lining's a little bit shorter, and the outer sleeve is actually flares slightly, and there's a reason for this that we'll see. On the inside, when you turn it over, you flat fell that seam, and then when you sew the seam together, you sew it like a long tube, and then that center seam, that single seam on the back, you flat fell it too, just like shown in the picture, and then you'll turn it right sides out. And if all goes well, you'll have a nice tube sleeve like this. And this is the reason why the outer sleeve and the inner sleeve are actually slightly different shaped at the end. And it's so that wool can actually be turned under like that to form a facing. Next, we'll sew the wool facing to both halves of the sleeve of the body lining, and then we'll get ready for the pocket placement. We'll place the pocket like this, and it'll be on the left side of the jacket. Then we hand stitch a little rectangle through the whole thing to hold it in place, and through that rectangle we'll cut a slit, and then we'll pull the two halves of the pocket flaps in through that slit, in on itself, and you'll end up with something like on the right side of your screen. Then you hand sew the actual pocket, and you just sew it around in kind of a U shape. And then we do some detail work here. You'll notice at the edges of the pocket slip, it's kind of like a buttonhole stitch, and then you do a simple running stitch along that bottom edge there to secure it. That just goes through the lining fabric and the pocket fabric, not clear through the pocket, of course, and it just secures it so that it won't pull loose. This type of detail work is found on both the North Carolina depot jackets and on the Richmond depot jackets as well. Now we'll make the back. You'll notice that the side panel pieces there are kind of longer than the curve on the actual back piece. And that's cut that way for a reason. So when you sew them together, you have to ease the pieces together. That means you just basically force them to fit without making pleats or obvious bends in the fabric. You just stretch the one and force the other one in. And you can use pins for this. I do it as I sew, and when it's done, it'll look something like the one on the right there. You'll notice there's much more fabric and it kind of bends. This gives room for the jacket when you're moving. A better picture of that easing on this picture of the finished backs. You'll see where there's a lot more give to the one piece there, to the side pieces that were larger, and that is so when the jacket is being worn, you'll have movement with the arms. With the lining, because it's cotton instead of wool and the wool stretches easier, it's a little bit easier to see that easing. Now we take the front pieces with our attached facing, and on the back side of that we put a reinforcement piece, and in this case I'm using pillow ticking. Pillow ticking and other types of just plain cotton duck was common. However, some jackets, like some of the Richmond Depot jackets, just used a second layer of lining for this. We started at the facing, and we sewed all around the outer edge of the jacket all the way back up to the end of the other facing at the collar. The collar neckline is left open, and then we turn the whole thing right sides out. When you turn it right sides out and press it, you'll have something that looks a little bit like this. Now we'll attach the sleeves. You just simply take the tube sleeve and that single seam, and you line it up between the two back seams, the shoulder seam and the back seam. You line it about right there in the middle. You can see on the picture on the right. Then you sew around the edge, and you should have something that looks like the one on the left. When it's done, you're just sewing through the wool. Some depot jackets, such as Richmond Depot, the sleeve actually was sewn through both the wool body and the lining body to make a hard point. On this particular jacket, however, I'm doing a floating lining, which means the lining and the outer body are actually sewn on separate seams. You can also see where it puckered, not really puckers, but is flared slightly. That again is because of easing. There is much more sleeve than there is arm opening. So you ease that sleeve into the arm opening. Some exaggerated examples of such as on frock coats, there's actually a lot of little miniature pleats in there to give them sleeves a lot of room. On this one, it's just simple easing. Then on the picture on the right, you can see where I'm doing that separate lining. I got the sleeve lining, which is shown on top here, and I am sewing it to the body lining, and I am not touching the outer wool. This is going to be a completely floating lining. There's not going to be a hard point right there. Both methods of sewing the sleeves like this, both methods are period and are found on a lot of different jackets and frock coats of the period. However, when you're doing the cotton, and in this case the sleeve lining is that cotton duck or that pillow ticking, it does not stretch or ease as easy as the wool does. So you have to make a little pinch or a mountain like this, like the picture on the left, and then you jam your needle through it, and when you pull your string tight, it'll actually pull that fabric down and it'll force it to fit without making any pleats. With the sleeves attached and the lining set, then you go on to the top stitching. You'll notice here I top stitched it with a simple running stitch. You can do whatever kind of stitch you want. A variety of stitches were used. And then I put in the hand done buttonholes, and I also closed that neckline at the top. It was common for depot or military jackets to have very crude top stitching, very quickly done. On this jacket, I went with a little bit closer top stitching because it was a copy or my version of a civilian tailor-made jacket. So I went with a little bit better quality buttonholes and a little bit closer top stitching. And then I attached the buttons. I actually used the full-size Eagle buttons, just the plain U.S. pre-war Eagle buttons. The South had many hundreds of thousands of these in their possession at the start of the war, so they're relatively easy to find throughout the war. This jacket is done. In general, this jacket would work great for any of the theaters, and it would work great through most of the war. It worked particularly well at the start of the war, but jackets like this would be seen being sent from the home front to the soldiers in the field throughout the war. It is not a depot issue jacket, but I think it would have been very appreciated by the service person who ended up getting it. So thank you so much. You can catch up with me at Corey's Trading Post on Facebook. And if you want to make one of these jackets, but you want to use actual homespun or jean cloth, Ben Tart sells some really accurate, really great jean cloth, and it's surprisingly not as expensive as you'd think it'd be. In fact, it's competitive with most wool out there. So go ahead and check his site out. If you're into model building and would like to try some of these paper models, feel free to check out www.ecardmodels.com. I have models on there. It's a site that's been around for a long time, and just recently it's being remade. So not all of our models are back online yet, but they are coming. You can also check out www.papermodelers.com. There are a lot of free models in the download section, and the people there are wonderful and would give you all kinds of advice. And of course, you can check out Models and More website. They have some of my free models on there, and they also have models from a variety of other designers. So go ahead and check them out. Thank you.